The sleek black SUV glided smoothly down a quiet suburban road, its engine barely making a sound. Inside, Andrea Miller, a 40-year-old black woman with a commanding presence, leaned back in her seat, savoring the calm after a long day. Andrea was not just any professional. She was the director of the FBI, one of the most powerful positions in American law enforcement. Yet tonight, she wasn't thinking about high-stakes cases or national security. All she wanted was to get home, enjoy a quiet dinner, and lose herself in a good book. The road was nearly empty, with only a handful of cars sharing the space. Andrea's headlights illuminated the asphalt ahead, the silence broken only by the rhythmic hum of the tires. Then in the rearview mirror, a sudden flash of red and blue lights pulled her out of her thoughts. The unmistakable sound of a police siren followed, signaling her to pull over. Andrea frowned, a mix of confusion and irritation creeping onto her face. She hadn't broken any traffic laws. Her speed was well within the limit, and she hadn't missed a single sign. Still, she dutifully steered her car to the side of the road and came to a stop. As she rolled down her window, a tall white man in his early 30s approached her car. His uniform was crisp, his badge reflecting the dim glow of the streetlights. His name tag read Jack Reynolds, and his expression was one of irritation, bordering on hostility. Without offering a greeting, Jack leaned down, his eyes scanning Andrea and her vehicle. "You were stopped for security reasons," he said coldly, his tone dismissive. Andrea straightened in her seat, her calm demeanor masking the annoyance simmering beneath. "Security reasons?" she asked, her voice measured. "Is there a problem with me or my vehicle?" Jack didn't answer her question. Instead, he barked, "Show me your vehicle registration and driver's license." Andrea hesitated for a moment before complying. She opened her glove compartment, retrieved the requested documents, and handed them over. Jack barely glanced at them before turning on his heel and heading back to his patrol car. Sitting alone in the silence, Andrea's thoughts raced. This wasn't the first time she had been treated unfairly because of her skin color, even in her high-ranking position. She had spent her entire career breaking barriers and proving doubters wrong, but moments like these still carried a sting. Jack returned after a few minutes, holding her documents loosely in one hand. "I need you to show me your ID," he demanded, his tone sharper now. Andrea raised an eyebrow. "My car registration and driver's license are valid. I've done nothing wrong. Why are you asking for my ID?" Jack crossed his arms, a smirk playing on his lips. "You have a suspicious attitude," he said. "A car like this? Someone like you? Doesn't add up." Andrea felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her composure. "Suspicious attitude? What exactly are you basing that on?" Jack shrugged, his gaze flicking dismissively over Andrea's simple yet elegant jacket. "Nothing special," he muttered, "but I'm in charge here. If you don't hand over your ID, I have every right to take you to the station." Andrea's grip tightened on the steering wheel. She forced herself to remain calm, her voice steady. "Sir, your request is illegal. I've provided all the necessary documents required by law. Unless you have a valid reason, I won't present additional identification." Jack's eyes narrowed, and his smirk turned into a sneer. "Don't tell me how to do my job, ma'am. People like you shouldn't challenge authority." Andrea froze momentarily at his words, the insult cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. Slowly, she met his gaze. "I'm not challenging your authority," she said, her voice firm. "I'm asking you to exercise it properly. What you're doing right now is an abuse of power, and it could get you into serious trouble." Jack leaned closer, his voice dripping with contempt. "Trouble? You don't scare me. Who do you think you are to talk to me like that?" Andrea's eyes didn't waver. "Someone who knows the law better than you do," she replied calmly. Andrea Miller remained seated in her SUV, her gaze steady as she met Jack Reynolds' defiant eyes. The situation was quickly spiraling out of control, and the tension between them was palpable. She had encountered men like Jack before, those who hid behind their authority to mask insecurities or exercise power unjustly. But she was determined not to let his arrogance get the better of her. Jack, now standing with his arms crossed, took a step closer to her car window. His presence loomed, his posture radiating hostility. "I'll tell you this one more time," he growled. "Show me your ID, or I'll have no choice but to detain you." Andrea's fingers gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She took a deep breath, reminding herself to stay calm. "Officer Reynolds," as she began, her voice measured, "I've already provided all legally required documents. Your demand for my ID is not only unnecessary, it's unlawful. If you insist on continuing this, you'll be held accountable." Jack's expression darkened. The idea of being challenged by anyone, especially a black woman, was clearly intolerable to him. "Accountable?" he scoffed, leaning down so that his face was inches from hers. "You've got some nerve. You think you're above the rules, don't you?" Andrea's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. "I don't think I'm above the rules, but I know the rules, and right now you're breaking them." Her calm rebuttal only seemed to fuel Jack's frustration. He straightened up, running a hand over the belt holding his holstered gun, a deliberate show of power. "You're walking a thin line here, lady," he sneered. "I don't have time to argue with someone like you. If you don't cooperate, I won't hesitate to use force." The threat hung heavily in the air, and for a moment the only sound was the faint hum of passing cars in the distance. Andrea glanced at Jack's hand resting near his weapon, the implicit danger clear, but she refused to let fear dictate her actions. "Using force against someone who's done nothing wrong," she said, her voice unyielding. "You're only proving my point. You're abusing your authority." Jack slammed his hand on the roof of her car, his patience clearly fraying. "Do you know who you're talking to?" he barked. "I'm the law here. You're just another stopped driver. If you don't comply, I'll make sure you regret it." Andrea's eyes didn't waver. She had faced worse threats than this, on much larger stages. "You might want to rethink that," she said evenly. "This isn't just about me. Your actions tonight could ruin your career." Jack laughed, a bitter mocking sound. "My career? You really think I care about what you have to say?" His hand moved closer to his gun. "This is your last warning." Andrea felt her pulse quicken, but her exterior remained calm. She knew this wasn't just about defending herself. It was about standing up to systemic abuse and injustice. Slowly, she reached for her phone, holding it up where Jack could see it. "What are you doing?" Jack demanded, his tone tinged with suspicion. Andrea pressed a number on speed dial and lifted the phone to her ear. "Calling someone who outranks you," she said simply. The line connected, and Andrea's voice was calm but commanding. "This is Andrea Miller," she said. "I'm being detained unlawfully by a police officer. I need the sheriff's presence immediately." Jack's eyes widened, his confidence faltering. "Who are you calling?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. Andrea didn't answer him directly. Instead, she relayed her location to the person on the other end of the line. "Thank you," she said before ending the call. Looking back at Jack, she said firmly, "The sheriff will be here shortly. I suggest you think very carefully about your next move." Jack's bravado was beginning to crumble. Though his hand lingered near his weapon, the gun itself stayed holstered, his face flushed with anger and uncertainty. "This isn't over," he muttered, but the cracks in his resolve were clear. Andrea, unwavering, prepared herself for what was to come, knowing that the situation was far from resolved. The flashing red and blue lights of an approaching vehicle pierced the night, growing brighter as the sheriff's SUV pulled up to the roadside. Andrea Miller sat motionless in her car, her expression calm yet resolute. Beside her, Jack Reynolds stood rigid, his hand still hovering near his holstered weapon. The arrival of the sheriff seemed to drain the last remnants of Jack's bravado, but his hostility lingered. The sheriff's car door opened, and Ethan Morales, a middle-aged Latino man with a commanding presence, stepped out. His tall frame and weathered face reflected decades of experience in law enforcement. Without hesitation, he strode toward Jack, his sharp gaze assessing the situation. "Reynolds," Sheriff Morales called out, his voice firm but tinged with disbelief. "What the hell is going on here?" Jack turned to face his superior, his shoulders stiffening. "Sir," he began, his voice uneven, "this woman refused to cooperate. She wouldn't show me her ID and she's being—" "Lower your tone and holster your weapon," Morales interrupted, his tone cutting. His eyes moved to Andrea, who remained composed but watchful. Morales noticed the tension in her posture, the weight of the moment heavy in the air. "Are you pointing a gun at an unarmed civilian?" Jack hesitated, then slowly stepped back, his hand falling away from his holster. "I was just doing my job," he muttered defensively. Morales narrowed his eyes. Your job doesn't include intimidating citizens or abusing your authority, he said sharply. Now step aside. Jack grudgingly moved away from Andrea's car, his face pale with a mixture of anger and uncertainty. Morales approached Andrea, his demeanor softening slightly. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm, "are you all right?" Andrea nodded, her tone measured as she replied, "I'm fine, Sheriff Morales." But this officer's actions were not only inappropriate, they were unlawful. Morales studied her face for a moment before something shifted in his expression. Recognition dawned in his eyes. "Director Miller," he said quietly, almost in disbelief. Jack froze, the color draining from his face. "Director?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Andrea's gaze didn't waver as she confirmed. "Yes." Andrea Miller, director of the FBI. For a moment, silence blanketed the scene. Jack's mouth opened, then closed as though he were struggling to process the revelation. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the gravity of his actions began to sink in. Morales turned to Jack, his face hardening. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he demanded. "You stopped and harassed the director of the FBI without cause, pointed a weapon at her, and violated her rights. This is beyond unacceptable. It's a disgrace." Jack stammered. "Sir, I didn't know who she was. I was just—" "You were just abusing your authority," Andrea interjected, her voice sharp but controlled. "It doesn't matter who I am. Your behavior tonight is a clear example of systemic abuse, and it has to stop." Morales nodded, his jaw tight. "Reynolds," he said, his voice cold, "return to the station. Write a full report about what happened here. I'll deal with you later." Jack hesitated, glancing between Morales and Andrea. "But—" "No buts," Morales snapped. "Go! Now!" Jack finally relented, walking stiffly back to his patrol car. As he drove off, the tension in the air began to ease, though the weight of the incident lingered. Morales turned back to Andrea, his expression apologetic. "Director Miller," he said, his tone more respectful, "I can't express how sorry I am for what happened tonight. This officer's behavior does not represent our department, and I will ensure he's held accountable." Andrea's gaze remained steady. "Thank you, Sheriff Morales," she said, "but this isn't just about me. It's about ensuring no one else has to endure what I just did." Morales nodded, a flicker of shame crossing his face. "You have my word," he said. "We'll conduct a full investigation and take appropriate action. I'll make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." Andrea studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I trust you'll do the right thing," she said, her voice firm. As Morales assured her once more of his intentions, Andrea knew this was far from over. She had stood her ground tonight, but the larger fight against systemic injustice and abuse of power was just beginning. The story of Andrea Miller's confrontation with Officer Jack Reynolds didn't remain confined to the quiet suburban road for long. Within hours, news of the incident had spread, fueled by eyewitness videos shared on social media. The footage, which captured Jack's condescending tone, his threats, and his eventual use of a firearm to intimidate Andrea, quickly went viral. By morning, headlines such as "FBI Director Harassed at Gunpoint by Local Police Officer" and "Abuse of Power Sparks Outrage in Small Town" dominated national news outlets. The public reaction was swift and fiery. Advocacy groups, civil rights organizations, and prominent figures across the country condemned the behavior, demanding accountability. Sheriff Ethan Morales, already grappling with the gravity of the situation, moved quickly to address the fallout. At a hastily arranged press conference, he stood before a room filled with reporters, his expression grim. Cameras flashed as he took the podium, the weight of his department's reputation pressing heavily on his shoulders. "Good morning," Morales began, his voice steady but somber. "Last night, an incident occurred involving one of our officers, Jack Reynolds, and FBI Director Andrea Miller. I want to make it clear that the actions of Officer Reynolds were unacceptable and do not reflect the values of this department." Morales paused, glancing at the sea of cameras. "I have launched a full internal investigation into this matter," he continued. "Officer Reynolds has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. Additionally, I have personally reviewed the body camera footage and found clear violations of protocol and conduct." The reporters erupted with questions, but Morales raised a hand to silence them. "I assure you this investigation will be thorough, transparent, and fair," he said firmly. "We owe that to Director Miller and to our community." Meanwhile, Andrea Miller maintained her usual composed demeanor as she prepared to address the media later that day. Dressed in a sharp navy blazer, she stepped onto the stage at a press event organized by the FBI. The room fell silent as she approached the microphone, her presence commanding. "I want to begin by thanking those who have reached out in support," Andrea said, her voice calm but resolute. "What happened last night was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger issue, systemic abuse of power and discrimination that continues to plague our society." Her words struck a chord with the audience. "This is not just about me," she continued. "It's about ensuring that no one, regardless of race, gender, or status, has to fear the people sworn to protect them. Accountability must be the standard, not the exception." Thunderous applause filled the room as Andrea stepped back from the podium, her message clear and unwavering. The public outrage only grew as the investigation into Jack Reynolds deepened. Body camera footage confirmed Andrea's account, showing Jack's unprofessional behavior and blatant abuse of authority. Audio recordings revealed his sneering remarks, including, "People like you shouldn't question the law." The evidence was damning, leaving little room for doubt. Civil rights leaders called for broader reforms, emphasizing that this was not just a local issue but a systemic one. Social media buzzed with hashtags like #JusticeForAndrea and #EndPoliceAbuse, amplifying the conversation nationwide. For Jack, the consequences were swift. Publicly shamed and stripped of his badge, he faced the harsh reality of his actions. In a brief statement to a local reporter, he stammered out an apology. "I made a mistake," he admitted, his voice subdued. "I let my judgment be clouded by my own biases, and for that, I'm sorry." But Jack's apology, while acknowledged, was not enough to quell the growing demands for change. Sheriff Morales, under immense pressure, announced a series of reforms within his department. These included mandatory anti-bias training for all officers, the implementation of new accountability measures, and the installation of body cameras across the force. Andrea supported these efforts but knew the fight wasn't over. As FBI director, she vowed to use her platform to push for national reform. "This incident is a reminder that we have a long way to go," she said during an interview. "But it's also a call to action. Change starts here, and it starts now." The confrontation between Andrea Miller and Jack Reynolds was no longer just a single incident. It had become a symbol of the fight against abuse of power, the demand for justice, and the belief that no one is above the law. Weeks after the confrontation between Andrea Miller and Jack Reynolds, the ripple effects continued to be felt across the country. The investigation into Jack's actions concluded swiftly, with undeniable evidence supporting Andrea's claims. As a result, Jack was permanently dismissed from the police force and barred from working in law enforcement again. His name became synonymous with abuse of power and prejudice, a cautionary tale of unchecked authority. Sheriff Ethan Morales, true to his word, implemented sweeping reforms in his department. Officers were required to complete mandatory training on bias awareness and de-escalation techniques. Transparency measures, such as enhanced body camera policies and a public complaint system, were introduced to rebuild community trust. Morales stood firm in his resolve, often citing the incident as a turning point. "This isn't just about fixing one mistake," Morales said in a public address. "It's about creating a culture of accountability and respect within law enforcement. We owe it to our citizens and to ourselves to do better." Andrea, while grateful for the swift resolution, knew her work was far from done. The viral nature of her story had elevated her to a new level of visibility, turning her into a symbol of resilience and justice. Invitations poured in for her to speak at forums, universities, and leadership summits. At one such event, Andrea addressed a crowd of young professionals eager to hear her perspective. "What happened to me is not unique," she said, her voice steady but impassioned. "It happens every day to people who don't have the platform or the power to fight back. My goal is not just to hold one officer accountable, but to inspire systemic change so that no one has to endure what I did." The audience erupted into applause, her words striking a chord with those who understood the depth of the issue. The story also sparked a broader national conversation. Civil rights organizations and lawmakers pushed for comprehensive police reform, citing Andrea's experience as a catalyst. Bills were introduced at the federal level to improve oversight and accountability within law enforcement agencies nationwide. Andrea used her platform as FBI director to advocate for these changes, often appearing before Congress and in media interviews. "True justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoing," she said during one televised interview. "It's about preventing it from happening in the first place. It's about creating systems that serve and protect everyone, equally and without prejudice." Her words resonated, and momentum grew for meaningful reform. Despite the progress, Andrea remained grounded. One evening, as she reviewed reports at her desk, she received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter that read, "Because of you, I found the courage to stand up for myself. Thank you for showing us what leadership looks like." Andrea sat back in her chair, her mind drifting to the countless people who had reached out to her since the incident. For every letter, message, or handshake, she felt the weight of their shared struggle and the responsibility to continue fighting for justice. Months after the incident, Andrea returned to the suburban town where it all began. She met with Sheriff Morales, who shared the progress his department had made since their last encounter. As they stood outside the sheriff's office, Morales extended his hand. "Thank you, Director Miller," he said, "for holding us accountable and for pushing us to be better." Andrea shook his hand firmly, her gaze steady. "This isn't just your fight, Sheriff," she replied. "It's all of ours." As she drove away, Andrea felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was long, but she was more determined than ever to see it through. She knew that while one battle had been won, the larger war against injustice was far from over, and she was ready to fight.